When the lawyer's voice came through the phone, soft and unsure, I was wiping crumbs from my kitchen counter, thinking the call would be another spam number or some small bill reminder, never once imagining it would open a door I had kept locked for 60 quiet years. Because when he said my full name, the one I had not heard spoken out loud in decades, something inside me went still, like a clock stopping between seconds. And he said, "Ma'am, I believe you may be the closest living relative to a woman reported missing in 1965. And even before he said the name, I knew who he meant, because some names never leave you, even when you learn not to say them. And as soon as I heard my sister's name spoken after all that time, I leaned against the sink to keep my legs from folding, because the world suddenly felt too heavy to stand in, and for a moment I could not breathe. And the lawyer kept talking, explaining files and documents and sealed records and a reopened inquiry linked to an old property matter. All these logical adult words floating around me, while my mind filled with the image of a 16-year-old girl sitting on the edge of her bed brushing her dark hair, humming low so Mama would not hear, her foot swinging like she was already ready to step out into the unknown. And I realized that for 60 years I had told myself that she was gone, somewhere safe, living a full life without us, because that story was easier to live with than the one where she had vanished into nothing. And now a stranger's calm voice was peeling that story away sentence by sentence. I remember answering questions I barely understood, telling the lawyer my age, confirming family details, spelling out our parents' names while tears slid down my face without a sound. Because grief doesn't always arrive like a storm. Sometimes it shows up like a long-held breath finally escaping your chest. And when the call ended, I sat down at the small dining table alone with my hands folded like a child in prayer, staring at a bowl of apples I had washed minutes earlier, thinking how ordinary everything still looked, even though the ground under my past had cracked wide open. I had lived an entire lifetime believing I had accepted my sister's disappearance, that I had folded the pain neatly and tucked it into some far corner of my heart, but the truth was that I had simply learned how not to touch it. And now, here it was, suddenly alive again, burning under my skin, because the lawyer didn't say she had been found alive or dead, only that something tied to her name had surfaced after all these years. And until the facts were confirmed, everything was uncertain. And uncertainty is the sharpest kind of remembering. I walked down the hallway to the bedroom where the morning light still lay across the quilt, and I sat on the bed holding my knees like I once did during thunderstorms when I was a girl, thinking of how it all started so quietly back in 1965, the way missing always does, not with alarms or flashing lights, but with empty space where someone should be, and how I was the last person who spoke to my sister before she stepped out our front door wearing Mama's old cardigan and that little hopeful smile she only used when trying to hide fear, and how I told her, "Be back before dark," never knowing it would be the last time my voice touched her ears. 60 years is a long time to carry unsaid words, a long time to wonder if there was something you should have said differently, held tighter, listened harder. And as the memory replayed with a cruel new brightness, I realized the lawyer wasn't reopening a case. He was reopening a wound that had never healed, only gone quiet. I thought about the years after her disappearance, how our parents faded into smaller people beneath the weight of not knowing, how Mama kept her second place at the dinner table ready for years before finally packing the plate away without a word, how Daddy would stand on the porch for long minutes staring down the road as if waiting for a shape to rise from the heat waves, and how I married, had children, grew old, built whole seasons of life on top of a hollow place shaped exactly like my sister. And for so long I told myself I survived this loss with strength, when really I survived it with silence. That phone call broke my silence wide open, and suddenly I wanted to talk to her, to apologize for moving forward when she couldn't, to tell her about the nieces and nephews who never knew her, about Mama's garden that bloomed wild after she was gone, about the way Daddy kept her photograph inside his wallet long after the ink had softened into blur. But speaking to the air felt too empty, because now there was movement in the story again, a chance, however small, that answers might finally rise where nothing but questions had lived. I called my daughter with shaking hands, not to alarm her, but because I needed another voice to ground me in the present. And when I said, "Someone called about your Aunt Lila," even she gasped, because Lila had become more legend than person to the next generations, someone spoken of with soft sadness but little detail. A woman paused forever at 16, And my daughter listened quietly as I explained through uneven breaths that a lawyer believed a record linked to her disappearance had resurfaced. And my daughter said gently, "Mom, maybe you'll finally get some peace." But the truth was, I didn't want peace. Not yet. I wanted truth, even if truth hurt more than peace ever could. That night, I barely slept, lying in the dark counting the years since 1965 and remembering moments I had buried. The sound of sirens days after Lila vanished, the neighbors whispering in small groups, the way people slowly stopped asking questions when no answers came, how the town learned to treat her name like a closed book, and how I learned to pack away hope because hope hurts when it stretches too long without relief. And as I listened to the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking wall clock, I thought about how the world had continued to spin for 6 decades while a 16-year-old girl remained frozen in mystery. And I realized that I had lived with 2 lives side by side all this time, the visible one filled with birthdays and school drop-offs and holiday dinners, and the invisible one where there was always a girl standing on the porch looking back at me one last time, and now the thin wall between those lives had finally cracked. When morning light washed over the room, I rose slowly, knowing the waiting had begun again, only this time waiting for answers rather than absence. And as I made coffee with unsteady hands, I whispered her name out loud for the first time in years, letting it settle into the air like a prayer finally spoken. Because after 60 years of silence, the story of my sister was stirring awake, and so was the part of me that I silenced with her, the part that still needed to know what truly happened to the girl who walked out our front door and never came home.
The days after that call stretched long and strange, each hour moving forward while my mind kept drifting backward, because once the door to memory opens, it does not close gently. It swings wide and lets everything rush through, and suddenly I was remembering details I had not touched in decades. The smell of Leela's hair after she washed it with Mama's rose soap, the way she hummed the same soft tune every time she folded laundry, the tiny scar on her left knuckle from when we climbed the oak behind our house and she slipped. And I kept thinking how none of these small things were written in any official record, how they only existed in me now, a fragile chain of proof that she was real beyond a name on a missing person form. The lawyer's voice replayed in my head while I tried to go about my daily routine, telling me that an old estate file surfaced during a property review tied to a woman whose identification matched my sister's birth certificate information, but listed under a different last name I didn't recognize. And that was the piece that unsettled me most, because Leela left our home unmarried with nothing but a small canvas purse. So how could another name become part of her story, and where had she gone that she needed a new one? I found myself pacing my living room at night, imagining thousands of possibilities, most of them painful, some hopeful, none certain, wondering if she lived a full life somewhere far away, believing we had simply let her go, or if something had stopped her path short, leaving unfinished plans scattered behind like fallen letters no one ever finished reading. I pulled out the old shoebox from the back of my closet, the one I had never brought myself to throw away, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, and inside were the few pieces of her that the years could not erase. 2 school photos where she tried and failed not to smile at the camera, her silver charm bracelet missing the heart charm she lost the week before she vanished, and a folded note written in her careful slanted handwriting that simply said, "I'll be back soon," a sentence that once felt comforting and now felt like the loneliest promise I had ever seen. Holding those things, I realized how heavy memory becomes when it sits alone too long, and how strange it is to grieve someone who has been both gone and not gone all at once, like mourning a ghost still walking somewhere unseen. When the lawyer called again to confirm I would cooperate with the reopened investigation, I heard myself agree without hesitation, even though fear pressed into my chest, because I was no longer strong enough to keep holding unanswered questions, and I knew that whatever truth waited at the end of this trail, good or bad, it belonged to Leela's story and to mine, and it deserved to finally be told. I made the drive to my childhood town a week later, something I rarely did anymore, my hands tightening around the steering wheel as familiar roads curved into view. Because everything looked the same and everything felt different. The old grocery store now painted blue instead of white, the school playground missing the tall rusted slide we loved, the oak tree behind our old house reduced to a weathered stump, and walking through that place felt like stepping through layers of time all at once, where the young woman I used to be walked beside the old woman I had become. I sat on the steps of our former front porch, now belonging to strangers, and I wondered if Leela ever came back here alone, just once, standing where I sat in secret silence, looking at the door she never knocked on, wondering whether we still waited inside. That thought shook me more than anything else, because it made our separation feel active rather than passive, a choice or a barrier instead of a mystery, and I struggled to breathe under the weight of it. At the small county records office, where the lawyer had arranged to meet, I waited in a quiet hallway lined with faded bulletin boards, my shoes echoing softly against tile as old as the one in my elementary school building, and I felt suddenly small, like the girl I once was, holding questions too big for her hands, praying that this long road would not end with more emptiness. When the lawyer finally appeared, he led me into a narrow office and placed a closed folder on the desk between us like something fragile, explaining that the documents connected to a woman who died years earlier in another state, whose fingerprints partially matched federal archives added long after her death, triggering the rediscovery process. And although no final confirmation had yet been made, all indicators pointed toward that woman being my sister. That word, died, fell into the room without sound, yet it felt louder than any shout. And I realized that even after 60 years of uncertainty, hearing the possible truth spoken aloud struck deeper than the silence ever had. I did not cry right away, because grief often pauses before flowing, letting the mind catch up to what the heart has known all along. But I looked down at the folder and whispered, she deserved more than to be a line in a file, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. Driving back home, the sun low and golden over the highway, tears finally slid free as I spoke to Leela's memory aloud, telling her how sorry I was that whatever path she had taken had ended alone, how I wished I had followed her out the door that day, instead of calling after her from the hallway like it didn't matter, how I wished I had told her she was loved more clearly and more often. That night, sitting at my kitchen table beneath the same soft light that illuminated the apples days earlier, I realized the call from the lawyer had not only reopened an unanswered case, but it had reshaped my understanding of love and loss, because loving someone never ends when they disappear, it only changes forms. Into waiting, into wondering, into quiet remembrance, carried forward through years of living without knowing, and now the waiting was nearing its end. And the next chapters of this story would no longer be built on uncertainty alone, but on whatever truth finally stepped forward after 6 long decades of silence, ready to meet the sister who never left my heart, even as the world believed she had vanished from it forever.
Before the world narrowed down to one missing person in a lifetime of waiting, our family had been a small, ordinary one, steady as the rhythm of our days. With Mama waking before sunrise to knead bread at the kitchen table and Daddy leaving for the mill with his lunch pail swinging, while Leela and I dressed for school in the shared bedroom that smelled faintly of sunlight and soak. And if anyone had looked at us then, they would have seen nothing special. Just 2 sisters growing up under a modest roof where love was shown more in actions than words. Because Mama wasn't one for hugs, and Daddy measured affection with quiet presence instead of praise. Yet there was warmth tucked into the corners of everything we did. Leela was 4 years younger than me, taller than most girls her age, with dark eyes that held more question than certainty. And she had a way of walking like she was already leaning forward into the next moment, as if the present never quite satisfied her curiosity. I, on the other hand, liked stillness and routine, finding comfort in folding clothes neatly and making grocery lists weeks ahead of time. We balanced each other in that small, invisible way sisters do, one dreaming outward, the other anchoring inward. Even so, we were close, whispering under blankets late into the night about movies we wanted to see or places we wanted to go, our words drifting between us like secret bridges. And we made small promises to travel together someday, not realizing how life's current shifts plans silently when you aren't looking. Mama often said Leela had too big a heart for a small town, but she meant it with gentle concern rather than criticism, because she worried our world might one day feel too tight around Leela's hopes. And in truth, she wasn't wrong. Leela loved stories of faraway cities and seaports she read about in library books, tracing imaginary maps with her finger across old atlas pages while sitting cross-legged on her bed, explaining to me with glowing excitement how she'd walk into places where nobody knew her name so she could start fresh as someone new, and I would laugh it off, telling her she'd miss Mama's cooking too much to ever go far. And she'd smile without arguing, because I think she knew I was wrong even then. At school, teachers said Leela was kind but distracted, her mind often wandering out the classroom window toward whatever waited beyond our town's dusty streets. And I sometimes wondered if the restlessness inside her came from something she couldn't name,
a quiet searching that didn't fit the ordinary life we all assumed awaited her. Boys noticed her beauty early, but Leela was shy around them, turning red and growing silent whenever anyone complimented her. And though Mama worried about that attention, Leela never encouraged it, choosing instead to spend most evenings helping Mama cook or braiding my hair on the back porch while we listened to cicadas sing to the falling sun. Daddy adored her quietly, setting aside coins so she could buy library books and journaling supplies even when money was tight, never telling her, but always making sure she found something small waiting for her at breakfast before a school trip or hard test day. In moments like those, our home felt safe and steady, and if cracks existed beneath the surface, none of us really saw them, or maybe we simply hoped they wouldn't grow wide enough to matter. As Leela grew older, though, small tensions began slipping gently into our family conversations like threads tugged too tight, especially around expectations for her future, because Mama believed strongly in staying close to home and raising a family, while Leela talked about working in cities, becoming a nurse or a social worker, something that meant seeing the wider world instead of settling into predictable domestic rhythms. Their debates were quiet, never raised voices, but loaded with longing on one side and worry on the other, and many dinners ended with Mama clearing plates a little too quickly while Leela retreated to her bedroom with unshed words still hanging in the air. I tried to play peacemaker, suggesting compromise paths like community college or temporary work programs, but neither fully felt heard, each believing I leaned slightly toward the other, which is the lonely role of the middle sister trying to hold two hearts steady at once. Leela confided most in me, laying beside me on the bed as the ceiling fan whirred slowly above us, saying she felt torn between wanting to honor Mama's dreams and needing to follow the voice inside her that kept whispering for more. And I listened, offering comfort, though I didn't truly know what advice to give, because I had already chosen stability over question years earlier, settling into a more predictable path without experiencing that internal pull she described. The spring Leela turned 16, something in her shifted more noticeably, subtle but real, like a door loosening on its hinges, and she began spending longer hours walking alone through town or sitting at the river's edge writing in a notebook she never let anyone read, her eyes carrying a thoughtful distance even when she smiled. She made new friends outside our usual circle, older girls who talked about hitchhiking cross-country or chasing work where it could be found, and though none of them seemed dangerous, their hunger for escape fed the spark already alive in her. And Mama noticed the change immediately. She began asking where Leela went after school, cooking her favorite meals more often as an offering of comfort, and warning her softly about the risks of wandering too far from those who loved her. But Leela responded with gentle defiance, insisting she simply needed space to think, to breathe beyond the tight weave of small-town life, and I watched all this unfold from the edges, feeling like a quiet participant in something larger than we could name, sensing movement toward a moment we could not yet see. On the morning Leela disappeared, there was no shouting or dramatic goodbye, only the familiar low hum of daily routine. Mama was at the stove frying eggs, Daddy had already left for work, and I was packing my lunch when Leela came in wearing Mama's old cardigan despite the warm weather, her hair brushed smooth and her expression oddly serene. She kissed Mama's cheek, hugged me longer than usual, and said she was meeting a friend before school, stepping outside before we could question the detail. And at the time, nothing about that felt alarming because small freedoms were normal for her age. All day I barely thought about it, assuming she'd be home for dinner as always. But when evening came and the clock crept beyond 7, Mama's face tightened with worry, and the house slowly filled with unease, questions replacing assumptions one by one. By midnight, Daddy was pacing a living room floor, while Mama sat gripping the telephone receiver over and over without dialing, and I felt cold awareness bloom in my chest that whatever was happening was beyond our control now. We contacted the police that night, our voices shaking as we described what Leela wore, her height, her gentle habits, and I watched each spoken detail reduce my living sister into an official description sheet, something I was not prepared to witness. For days afterwards, we searched everywhere, posting flyers, questioning classmates, asking clerks and neighbors, and reliving the last hours she spent among us with exhausting scrutiny. Yet every attempt returned empty, and over weeks that stretched into months, the absence settled into our home like invisible dust, coating every surface until even breathing felt heavy. The town eventually grew quiet around the story, as communities often do when mystery becomes too uncomfortable to carry openly, leaving us to sit alone with the unanswered weight. And I became the quiet holder of my parents' grief, supporting Mama as she cried into dish towels at night and absorbing Daddy's stoic silence without knowing how to ease it. Our family learned to continue without truly moving forward, building lives around a hole that never closed, because nothing truly replaces a person you lose without explanation. And now, sitting decades later with a legal file reopened and memory unlocked, I could see how the foundation of everything that followed in our lives traced back to those early days of routine, tension, dreams, and quiet love, to the moments before disappearance reshaped all of us forever into people defined not just by who stayed, but by who left and never returned.
In the long months that followed Leela's disappearance, our home became a place where time seemed frozen in small, ordinary gestures repeated without joy, because Mama kept cooking meals sized for 4 even when only 3 of us sat at the table, refusing to adjust portions as if doing so might make our loss real. While Daddy returned from work and placed his lunch pail in the same corner every evening with mechanical steadiness, never speaking much but checking the mail twice each night, as though a letter might suddenly appear explaining everything, and I floated between them, trying to hold things together with small acts of care that felt too delicate against so much quiet pain. The police questioning slowed after the first few weeks, their visits shifting from urgent to polite and finally to absent altogether, though Mama kept a notebook by the phone listing every call she made, asking about updates that never came, her handwriting growing smaller with each empty entry. Our town, once lively with worried whispers about the missing girl, gradually moved on as towns always do. New news replaced old heartbreak, new faces filled the streets, and Leela became less a conversation and more a memory people approached politely or avoided altogether. And though I understood the human need to continue living, I felt a private bitterness sprout each time someone spoke casually about how long it's been, as if the passage of time was something that cured loss rather than stretched it thin. Mama began slipping into moments of deep silence, staring out the kitchen window without seeing the garden she once loved tending, touching Leela's empty chair as she passed without realizing she did it. And I would gently guide her back into conversation when she drifted too far inward, knowing that if I didn't, her grief would swallow what spark remained in her spirit. Daddy carried pain differently, burying himself longer into work hours, coming home late with slumped shoulders and eyes that rarely met anyone's anymore. And on paydays, he still handed Mama the full envelope as always, yet there was a faint trembling in his hand that told me he was barely holding himself upright beneath the weight of uncertainty. The years rolled forward because time always does, even when we beg it to pause, and slowly I stepped into adulthood while simultaneously remaining an emotional caretaker, supporting 2 grieving parents while still processing my own unanswered questions. And though no one ever said it outright, an unspoken understanding settled over our household that we survived as long as we did not fully confront the depths of what we had lost. Mama packed away most of Leela's personal belongings except the essentials, a few dresses still hung in the shared closet, a box of notebooks tucked beneath the bed, and her silver bracelet resting in Mama's jewelry dish like a talisman of remembrance. And we did not discuss these keepsakes openly, yet their quiet presence acted as constant reminders that one of us had wandered out of frame but never out of mind. When I married at 21, Mama sewed my gown with careful attention and tried to smile throughout the ceremony. But I saw the tears she wiped away quickly when she thought no one watched, because every milestone I reached without Leela beside me reminded her of the daughter who would never reach her own milestones where we could see them. Daddy walked me down the aisle rigid and silent, pride and sorrow woven tightly across his face, and though I was happy that day, a shadow lingered around the joy.
because the celebration felt incomplete with an empty space where my sister's laughter should have been. After starting my own family, I tried to create a brighter normalcy, determined not to let grief stain the next generation before it even began. Yet Leela existed naturally in the stories I told my children, even if her absence confused them at times. I spoke of her as a young aunt with adventurous dreams and kind heart, carefully softening the unresolved nature of her disappearance into something less frightening, telling them she traveled somewhere far and simply never returned home, because that narrative was easier for a child to hold than the truth of open-ended mystery. Mama delighted in her grandchildren, but also withdrew at moments when their laughter echoed too closely to what she had lost, retreating quietly into the bedroom until she could compose herself again. And Daddy, growing older and stooped, found renewed gentleness among them, passing on small life lessons with fewer words than ever, but deeper emotion behind each gesture. Even as we moved into new chapters, the question of Leela never left me, and once every few years I contacted local authorities, tracing records, following rumors, and revisiting old witness statements in the faint hope that something overlooked might suddenly shift meaning. But each effort ended the same way, in sympathy-laced phone calls promising diligent review followed by silence, until I learned that the world does not often revisit its own forgotten mysteries without a reason. And so I stopped hoping actively and moved into the quiet posture of acceptance instead, or at least what passes for acceptance when you are tired of disappointment. Mama passed away in her late 70s, with Leela's bracelet still resting on the bedside table, and in her final days she held my hand often, whispering prayers under her breath that at least one of her daughters might see the other again someday, whether here or somewhere beyond her sight. And when she slipped away peacefully one winter night, I felt a second loss settle over me, like a familiar ache returning with a new name. Daddy lived a few years longer, retreating ever deeper into silence, and when I cleaned out his small belongings after his passing, I found Leela's faded photograph tucked inside his worn wallet, exactly where I suspected it had been for decades, the crease lines smoothed by constant care, a quiet testimony of a father who never stopped carrying his missing child close to his heart. With both parents gone, I felt the weight of being the sole guardian of Leela's memory, the last voice left to speak her name with true familiarity, and I feared that without answers, her story would eventually dissolve into a paragraph of vague family legend that no one would fully understand or deeply feel. Still, I carried on, tending my household, watching my children grow into adults and eventually blessing grandchildren with soft kisses and bedtime stories, determined to give them a sense of emotional safety, even while a part of me remained suspended inside a question that had followed me my entire life. Stillness became my closest companion in later years, and alongside it came reflection, endless quiet moments when I wondered if somewhere Leela had built a life parallel to mine, raising children of her own, loving deeply, laughing loudly, and maybe wondering about the sister she had left behind as well. The unanswered nature of that thought always settled with a dull ache behind my ribs, not sharp enough to cripple me, but persistent enough to never fully fade. So when the lawyer's call came after all those years, it landed not on a raw wound, but on a scar that had long concealed tenderness beneath its hardened surface, bringing every stage of loss rushing backwards into present awareness at once. Sitting at my kitchen table after that conversation, surrounded by the ordinary comfort of modern life, photographs of grandchildren lining the fridge, the low hum of the dishwasher filling the room, I realized how much of my adult identity had been shaped by Leela's disappearance, even when I believed I had outgrown that loss. I had become quieter, perhaps more cautious, investing deeply in family stability, likely as a subconscious answer to the uncertainty of my youth, building gentle routines that promised continuity where absence once ruled. And now, with memory and investigation awakening together, I understood that my carefully built peace had rested on incomplete foundations, because true closure had never happened, only endurance masked as healing. The reopened inquiry meant I would finally step back into the unresolved story I had learned to carry silently for so long, not as a desperate searching sister snatching at rumors, but as an elder witness to a truth deferred for 60 years, ready at last to face whatever reality waited behind Leela's disappearance, not for answers alone, but because my family's past and my own heart deserved illumination after decades of waiting in the darkness.
The investigation, slow and deliberate, pulled me back into a world I thought I had learned to live outside, one filled with half-answered questions and documents with corners folded from decades of handling. And from the very first moment I met the lawyer in person, I could feel the tension knotting inside me, a quiet panic that had been buried beneath years of routine, now unfurling like smoke in the air, because every folder he handed me, every record he referenced, contained fragments of a life I had imagined only in pieces, and yet pieces that seemed somehow alive again. He explained that some records of Leela's life after she disappeared had been filed under an alias, and though they were sparse, they hinted at movements across several states, some temporary employment, some medical care, all under different names. And the more I read, the more I realized how tangled her journey had been, and how easy it had been for her to vanish without a trace, even from the family who loved her most. My heart ached with each new line, imagining her navigating unfamiliar cities, lonely apartments, transient friendships, small jobs she may or may not have enjoyed, and all the while wondering if she had ever once longed to come home, or if home itself had become impossible for her to reach. I found myself flipping through the records over and over, eyes scanning names and dates, connecting dots that may or may not have been real, trying to picture the sister I knew in the face of a life lived in quiet invisibility. And each imagined scene cut me deeper, because even if she had been safe, she had been alone. And that reality felt almost worse than not knowing anything at all. I remember one afternoon sitting by the window with the stack of documents and letters that the lawyer had collected, hands trembling as I read a brief report from a small hospital where Leela had been admitted for what seemed a minor illness. Yet even that brief note sparked the cascade of emotion, because it was proof that she had existed somewhere beyond our family's memory. And yet that existence was a shadowed one, unaccompanied by anyone who could have loved her as we did. It was in those moments that I began to notice a tension building inside me, not just from grief, but from guilt and uncertainty, because I kept asking myself, could I have done something differently? Should I have noticed signs I ignored, been braver in letting her leave, or followed her in some way? And though rational thought reminded me that she had choices of her own, the weight of imagined responsibility pressed into my chest with quiet, relentless pressure. As the lawyer shared more about official correspondence and traceable locations, he also cautioned me that some of the data was inconclusive, requiring patience and verification, and I noticed my own body responding with agitation, a restlessness that left me pacing the room late into the night, unable to settle even with familiar surroundings around me, because the idea of waiting once again for answers seemed almost unbearable after all the decades of silence. I would rise from my chair, clutch a cup of tea that had long gone cold, and stand at the window staring out at the quiet street, trying to imagine Leela walking down it at 16, just as I had done many times before. Only this time she was older in my mind, and every detail about her felt fragile and precious, like a glass figurine I might shatter with a careless breath. At times, I felt like the weight of 60 years of absence was pressing down on me, making it difficult to distinguish memory from speculation, and the uncertainty began to create tension not just in my thoughts, but in my relationships, because as I shared small updates with my adult children, their responses were cautious, their voices tinged with concern, and I could sense their unspoken worry that reopening the past might harm me further rather than bring closure. And perhaps they were right. Yet I could not stop myself from wanting to uncover what had happened, to trace Leela's story to its fullest conclusion. The lawyer's careful, measured tone sometimes irritated me because I wanted answers immediately. But he reminded me with quiet patience that reconstruction of someone's life across decades required precision, corroboration, and time. And so I learned to sit with uncertainty once again, though this time the silence felt sharper, not softened by youthful ignorance, but by grown-up awareness of the depth and finality of what could emerge. Small tensions began emerging within my own home as the investigation continued, subtle but insistent, because my children watched me carrying the documents from room to room, eyes lingering on my hands, observing every sigh and furrow of my brow. And they began asking questions about Leela that I struggled to answer without breaking into tears or revealing the full emotional weight I carried alone. "Mom," my daughter asked one evening, holding a letter in her hand, "do you think Aunt Leela, did she want to come back?" And the simple question felt like a knife pressing against old scars because I did not know the answer, and I had to swallow hard to prevent my voice from quivering. I told her softly, "I hope she did, sweetie. I hope she always wanted to come home," though part of me feared that hope might be cruel, that Leela's journey, whatever it had been, might have left her unable to return, physically or emotionally. My children, though supportive, sometimes pressed further, curious and frightened, and I noticed that this investigation was not just reopening old wounds for me, but subtly reshaping how they viewed our family history. And I worried that the weight of missing pieces might feel heavier on them than it ever had on me, because at least I had learned to live alongside absence, while they were encountering the reality of loss in a way that had never touched their lives directly before. Adding to the tension, there were practical complications. Records missing, offices closing before I could follow up, conflicting statements and archived police files, and occasional dead ends that left me staring at walls in disbelief, wondering how something that seemed so concrete on paper could unravel into ambiguity so easily. There were moments when I felt trapped between worlds, the one I had lived in all these years, comfortable in its routines and quiet memories, and the one the lawyer was pulling me into, full of fragmented truths and the promise of revelation, each tugging in different directions, leaving my emotions frayed and raw. In late evenings, I would sit with Leela's old notebook, tracing the lines she had drawn as a girl, imagining her thoughts, her unspoken fears, and her excitement, and the juxtaposition of her youthful curiosity with the stark reality of records spanning decades made me feel unmoored, like standing on the edge of a river that had carried her downstream, unable to follow, but desperate to know if she had ever looked back. At the same time, I began to notice my own reactions. Irritability when people didn't understand the urgency I felt, tearfulness over minor triggers, fatigue that could not be remedied by rest, small signs that my long-guarded grief was surfacing in ways I hadn't anticipated. And with every phone call, document review, and passing reference to her possible whereabouts, the tension inside me thickened, building a storm I could neither ignore nor disperse, because the past was alive again, demanding attention, and it would not settle quietly while I processed it. Even more challenging were the moments when conflicting information surfaced, sometimes from the lawyer, sometimes from public records, suggesting that Leela's life may have taken directions we could not imagine, that she may have crossed paths with people who could have altered her course. And in some letters, hints of medical treatment or brief residences in towns far from our own appeared with no explanation. Each discovery forced me to reconcile the sister I remembered, a vibrant, hopeful 16-year-old, with the fragmented, shadowed existence that evidence suggested she had lived, and it created an inner conflict I could not resolve easily. Did I continue to imagine her as she was, the girl I loved and lost, or accept the possibility that she had been someone I would scarcely recognize after decades away? I found myself questioning my memories, doubting my own recollections, and wondering if nostalgia was betraying me with rose-tinted filters. Because when faced with evidence, even subtle and incomplete, the mind seeks patterns, and patterns are not always truth. And yet, even amidst the confusion and emotional upheaval, a quiet determination began to root itself in me, because after 60 years of waiting and wondering, I could not simply step away from this story again. Whatever lay hidden, whatever truths remained, I needed to find them, not just for me, but for Leela, and for the family who still carried her absence like a small, persistent ache in their hearts.
As the investigation deepened, the tension that had quietly built began to manifest in ways I could not ignore. Because every new document, every small lead pulled me further into Lila's hidden life, while simultaneously tugging me away from the reality I had constructed over decades, and I felt unsteady walking between these worlds, my hands trembling when I touched old letters and photocopies of records, my chest tight with the weight of imagining her alone in strange cities, moving from apartment to apartment, working small jobs,
forging a life we had never seen, and yet also hoping for proof that she had been safe, that someone had cared for her even if we could not. The lawyer explained patiently that piecing together her trail was like assembling a puzzle with missing pieces, some faded beyond recognition, some contradicting one another, and as he spoke, I realized that the very act of reconstructing her history was also reconstructing my grief, peeling away years of learned endurance and exposing raw emotion I had long buried under layers of routine and responsibility. Nights became long and restless. I would sit in the quiet of my living room with the folder on my lap, tracing dates and addresses, imagining the small, unseen details of her daily existence, what she had eaten for breakfast, whether she laughed at jokes no one remembers, whether she ever paused to remember us, while outside, the world continued, unaware of the slow, intense unraveling of a family's history happening in my home. Small arguments with my children began surfacing, gentle but sharp, because they did not fully understand the emotional intensity I was navigating, and I snapped over minor things, guilt and frustration layered beneath my words. Yet it was impossible to explain the inner storm to them without breaking down entirely. Even the simplest household tasks felt overwhelming. I could not concentrate on laundry or cooking because my mind replayed photographs of her as a child and the possibility of what she had become, and I felt an ache that combined longing, fear, and responsibility in a way I had never anticipated at my age. The lawyer's visits, though calm and measured, introduced their own tension because with each meeting I realized how much of Lila's life had unfolded outside of our knowledge, and I began to question the reliability of the memories I had clung to for decades, wondering if they were accurate reflections or softened illusions constructed to make her absence bearable. I recalled her shared bedroom, the small desk where she wrote stories I never read, the window she liked to sit by, imagining the world beyond, and I asked myself whether my memory honored her life or merely preserved a fragment I preferred to keep safe. Each thought created a ripple of conflict inside me because the sister I remembered might not have existed exactly as I imagined, and accepting the unknown meant confronting that the girl I loved might have suffered, or that she might have lived a life filled with choices and experiences I could not fully comprehend. The very idea of someone else shaping her story without us being part of it felt like a betrayal, not of intention, but of circumstance. And I realized that grief is not only about loss, but also about reconciling control, or the lack of it, in a world where the people we love can vanish, unseen and unheard. Complications arose as some evidence contradicted other pieces. An address listed for her in one file placed her in a distant city at a time when another record suggested she was elsewhere. A brief medical note implied she had been treated for an illness we had never known about, and a witness statement mentioned a girl resembling her in a small town far from anything we expected. Each discrepancy left me unsettled, wondering whether these were mistakes, fabrications, or fragments of the truth that had grown distorted by time and circumstance. And every unanswered question added weight to a tension that already pressed against my chest day and night. I began to notice physical symptoms of stress, restless sleep, a tightness in my jaw, a pit of anxiety that sometimes rose like a wave when I least expected it, a trembling in my hands when I touched documents or old photographs, and even brief episodes of doubt, wondering if I was doing the right thing, or if reopening the past might inflict harm that could not be undone. Yet even amidst the exhaustion and uncertainty, a determination rooted itself firmly within me, because this was no longer simply about finding answers. It was about honoring the sister I had lost to absence, the girl whose life had unfolded in silence, and the family who had learned to live around a hollow place where she should have been. Interactions with the lawyer grew more intense as new leads emerged, each requiring careful consideration and emotional preparation, because some leads implied uncomfortable realities. Lila may have made choices that surprised us, avoided contact deliberately, or even suffered misfortune in ways no one could have prevented, and the possibility of uncovering difficult truths weighed heavily alongside the hope of closure. I found myself vacillating between optimism and fear, reading correspondence, tracing addresses, and compiling timelines with almost obsessive attention, knowing that one overlooked detail might unlock understanding or prolong anguish indefinitely. I noticed that my own family observed these changes. My adult children gently reminded me to eat, to rest, or to step back, aware that my emotional investment in the investigation was consuming more than just my time. And I silently appreciated their concern, even as I pushed forward, because the pull to uncover Lila's story was stronger than comfort or caution. At night, I would stare at the ceiling, whispering her name as if calling might bridge decades of separation, imagining the life she had lived, imagining her alone or with friends unknown to us, imagining the moments when she must have questioned whether anyone back home still remembered her or wished for her return, and each imagined scenario layered grief over hope in a way that left me both breathless and determined. Gradually, small emotional fractures began appearing in ways I could not ignore. Brief flashes of anger at officials who could not provide immediate clarity, moments of guilt for my own impatience, and a recurring quiet panic whenever I realized that time was finite and the sister I had waited for might never fully reappear in my life except through documents and fragments of evidence. I began to question every memory of her, every story I had told myself, and every assumption I had made about the life she might have lived, because reconstruction demanded that I set aside comfort and confront what reality could offer, whether it aligned with the memories I cherished or challenged them beyond recognition. Even as I did this, I became aware of the subtle emotional toll on my own sense of self. Sleepless nights, restless hands, racing thoughts, and a heart that could not find rest until the story had been traced as fully as possible. And yet each day I returned to the work, driven by a need deeper than curiosity, a need to honor her life and to finally understand the sister who had disappeared into silence 60 years ago.
The moment that shifted everything came unexpectedly, as though the past had been quietly waiting for me to notice a single thread and now finally tugged it hard enough to unravel decades of careful silence. And it began with a call from the lawyer, calm but measured, telling me that a long-forgotten record had been discovered tucked inside a storage box in a courthouse basement, a box labeled simply with years and numbers that held files no one had touched in over half a century. And inside, a bundle of papers directly linked to Lila, medical forms, letters, property transfers, and even a brief faded diary she had written under an assumed name, all of it suggesting a life lived far from us, yet filled with events, choices, and people unknown, which immediately made the entire story of her disappearance feel alive again, more immediate, more real than any memory I had clung to for all these years. When I first held the folder in my hands, the paper rough beneath my fingers, I felt a jolt of disbelief and wonder, because there, in ink faded by time but not by intent, was evidence that my sister had existed in ways we had never imagined, a woman who had made deliberate choices, built small moments of life that had gone entirely unnoticed by those who loved her most. And yet the very existence of these papers created a new tension, a pressure I could not name, because alongside hope for clarity came the weight of truth, the potential that her story might not match the one I had held sacred in memory. I sat at my kitchen table, my hands shaking as I unfolded the first document, a letter typed on thin paper, yellowed around the edges, addressed to a relative in another state who had been a family friend decades before. The words tentative, apologetic, and full of longing. And as I read, I realized that Lila had been conscious of her absence from us, had made the deliberate choice to live apart, and that realization struck me harder than the initial disappearance ever had, because for 60 years I had imagined her lost to chance, not to choice, and this new knowledge blurred the lines between grief and anger, love and resentment, hope and despair. I remember pressing my hand to my forehead, feeling a wave of exhaustion unlike anything I had experienced, because the years of imagined mystery suddenly collided with reality, and reality was complicated, layered, and far beyond what I had anticipated or prepared for. The lawyer explained carefully that each document in the folder connected to legal matters, changes in identity, and temporary addresses, painting a picture of a life that had been hidden not by malicious intent, but by necessity, circumstance, and perhaps fear. And with each revelation, I felt my heart both ache and swell, because here was my sister,
alive in a history we had never known, yet absent for reasons we had never fully understood. I traced the edges of the papers as though touching them might transmit understanding from ink to blood, and for hours I read, imagined, and grieved simultaneously because these pages created a bridge to the woman Leela had become, and yet reminded me painfully of the girl I had lost when she was 16. It was overwhelming, disorienting, and intensely intimate, a collision of past and present that left me exhausted but compelled, because the story that had been paused for 60 years was moving forward now in ways I could neither stop nor fully control. As I worked through the documents, I began to notice small patterns in dates and locations that suggested she had returned, briefly, to towns familiar to her, perhaps to check on us from a distance, and that possibility made my heart flutter with a mixture of relief and sorrow, because even if she had been close in spirit, we had never recognized it, and those years without knowledge felt heavier than ever in retrospect. The diary entries were the hardest to read, short, measured, often cryptic, reflecting a young woman torn between fear and hope, between desire for freedom and love for family, and each line forced me to confront the complexity of a choice I had never understood. Because for the first time, I saw Leela not just as the sister who vanished, but as a person navigating her own path through an uncertain world, and the weight of understanding her life in its fullness was both thrilling and unbearably painful. I sat back, the folder still open, and realized the turning point was not simply finding evidence, but confronting the truth that for 60 years I had been carrying assumptions about her life, grief shaped by silence and speculation, and now the narrative demanded that I reconcile what was imagined with what actually had been, a reconciliation that promised neither comfort nor ease, but a necessary reckoning with decades of loss, love, and unanswered questions.
The discovery of the diary and records shifted the investigation from abstract to intensely personal, because within those yellowed pages, I began to see the contours of a sister I had loved, yet never truly known. And with each revelation, a storm of emotions rose in me. Relief that she had survived, grief for the years we lost, anger at the circumstances that separated us, and awe at the resilience she must have carried silently all these decades. And it was in that tangled mix that I realized the turning point was more than just evidence. It was recognition, acceptance, and confrontation with a life that had unfolded independently, fully, without us. One entry described her first apartment in a city 3 states away, where she had taken a small job at a hospital and paid her own bills, noting the loneliness she sometimes felt, but also the pride and self-reliance. And I could not stop my hands from trembling, because I had pictured her only as a missing child, not a capable woman navigating adulthood alone. And the contrast made every lost year ache differently, sharply, and profoundly. Another letter revealed correspondence with a distant cousin, a plea for understanding, as she explained her reasons for leaving home and choosing a new identity. The words gentle, yet firm, a careful negotiation of loyalty and independence. And reading them, I felt a quiet rupture inside me, because for 60 years we had imagined her disappearance as a random tragedy, yet now I understood it had been an act of self-preservation, a choice made in the margins of a world too small to contain her dreams. And recognizing that choice carried both validation and sorrow, because it affirmed her strength while also confirming that no amount of waiting or longing could have altered the course she took. The records traced brief periods of employment, hospital visits, and relocations, all hinting at a life lived quietly, responsibly, often in the shadow of her own fear. And I began to see the pattern of her movements, piecing together a timeline that stretched from the day she disappeared to her last known address decades later. And each connection, each date, each name was a small revelation that made the decades of absence feel simultaneously closer and heavier. I realized that the turning point was also emotional, because I could no longer hold on to the comforting illusion that Lila's story was static, frozen in time, a missing girl forever suspended in our memory. She had lived fully, quietly, in ways we could not have imagined.
And the process of discovering that truth required mourning what I had assumed while embracing the reality of what had been. I remember sitting for hours in silence after reading a particularly vivid diary entry where she described a hospital stay alone, noting her fear of being forgotten. And suddenly the separation between us was not only measured by time, but by experience, by the invisible distance of 60 years lived apart, each of us shaping life in isolation, yet still tethered by memory and love. And I felt the simultaneous pull of regret and gratitude, because even as I mourned lost moments, I also marveled at the endurance she had shown, the quiet courage that had allowed her to survive unseen. The folder also included a brief will and property document indicating that she had wanted her story preserved in some official form, perhaps hoping that someone would eventually understand. And that realization struck me deeply because it implied intentionality, a message sent across time to a family who had been waiting, a bridge finally extended from her to us. I could feel the gravity of the moment pressing down, every emotion intensified, because the years of waiting, the decades of quiet endurance, were culminating in the undeniable presence of a sister who had been there all along, just beyond our reach. And I understood that nothing could erase the intervening years, yet everything could now be reshaped by knowledge and understanding. The turning point was no longer simply about finding Lila. It was about meeting the person she had become, reconciling the sister I remembered with the woman she had lived into, and preparing myself to navigate the emotional terrain that would follow. Truths both comforting and painful, revelations that demanded acknowledgement, and the delicate task of holding her memory and her reality simultaneously, knowing that the journey toward resolution had only just begun, yet that every step forward was now guided by clarity, not uncertainty, for the first time in 60 years.
The days that followed the discovery of Lila's records were both exhausting and strangely comforting because each new document, letter, or diary entry offered answers, but also demanded that I face emotions I had kept dormant for decades, and I found myself moving through a careful balance of reflection, grief, and growing understanding, like walking along a narrow path with both beauty and danger on either side. I spent hours at my kitchen table, reading her words aloud to the quiet house, imagining her voice as she had written them, noting the humor, the small anxieties, the triumphs, and even the loneliness that threaded through her life. And with every line, I felt closer to her, even as the weight of 60 years apart pressed against me. My children and grandchildren would occasionally sit nearby, listening silently as I shared fragments, careful not to overwhelm them, but also compelled to let them know who their aunt had truly been, a living, breathing person who had chosen her path and survived it with dignity, courage, and quiet fortitude. And I noticed their eyes widening with a mixture of wonder and sadness, realizing that Lila's absence had shaped not only my life, but the lineage of our family in ways subtle yet profound. I began to organize the documents, creating a timeline of her life, noting her travels, work experiences, brief friendships, and moments of joy and sorrow. And with each entry added to the growing record, I could feel a sense of wholeness forming, not because the past could be undone, but because I was finally seeing it fully, honestly, without the blinders of speculation. And in that clarity, there was healing. There were moments when the truth hit me sharply, like reading about a small misfortune she endured alone, or realizing a brief illness had taken her by surprise in a place far from family, and I felt grief anew. But I also felt pride, a quiet, steady pride in the resilience that my sister had shown over a lifetime that had been invisible to us. In the evenings, I would sit in my living room with her photographs spread out beside me, tracing her features with my eyes, remembering the little girl she had been, and reconciling it with the woman the documents revealed. And slowly, painstakingly, I began to release decades of imagined guilt because I saw now that she had lived her life with intention, making choices that she believed were right for her. And though we had not been part of those years, her decisions were hers alone, and I had no claim to blame. The lawyer, who had become a steady presence throughout this process, explained that a final verification of her identity was forthcoming, that the collected evidence strongly indicated it was indeed Lila, and though we could not bring her back or undo the past, we could finally acknowledge her existence in its full breadth, and that acknowledgement became a balm for long-held pain,
a permission to grieve fully while honoring her life authentically. I felt a strange, almost delicate sense of relief because the uncertainty that had shadowed me for decades was lifting, replaced by a clear, tangible understanding of the sister I had loved, the woman she had become, and the years that had passed with so many invisible threads connecting us. My mind often wandered through memories of our childhood, remembering small arguments, laughter, and quiet evenings on the porch, now recontextualized with the knowledge that she had carried those same memories within her as she navigated her own unseen life, and that recognition brought a bittersweet comfort, a realization that, even in absence, family and love persist in unseen forms. Slowly, I began to write letters of my own to her, words I could not send, but which allowed me to speak directly to the sister I had lost, telling her how proud I was, how deeply I had missed her, how I had carried her through every birthday, holiday, and quiet evening, and in doing so, I felt the knot in my chest loosen slightly, because the act of acknowledging her existence, her choices, and her strength became an act of connection across the decades. Friends and extended family began noticing a change in me, a gentleness tempered with quiet resolve, a calmness that had been absent for years, and I realized that part of resolving the past was not only understanding Lila's story, but also allowing myself to heal, to release the tension of carrying unanswered questions alone, and to embrace a life reshaped by clarity rather than speculation. In moments of solitude, I would return to the folder, reviewing entries, letters, and photographs, each one a touchstone connecting me to her life, and I began to internalize the understanding that closure was not a single moment, but a gradual process of seeing, feeling, and reconciling, a process that allowed grief and love to coexist, and in that coexistence, I found a measure of peace I had not thought possible. Even the mundane routines of daily life became infused with subtle joy because I carried her presence with me in a new way, not as a ghost of loss, but as a testament to endurance, courage, and the lasting impact of familial bonds. And I could finally recognize that the weight of 60 years of absence had paradoxically prepared me to appreciate the quiet profundity of understanding her fully. And in that understanding, my own life and the lives of those around me found gentle restoration, a delicate balance between memory, grief, and the acknowledgement of a sister's long unseen journey.
As the weeks passed, I began to piece together a fuller understanding of Leela's life, combining the letters, diary entries, and official records into a coherent narrative that reflected her resilience, independence, and quiet courage. And in doing so, I realized that resolution was not about reclaiming the years lost, but about honoring the life she had actually lived, with all its choices, struggles, and triumphs, because those decades apart had shaped her just as they had shaped us who waited. I found myself speaking aloud to her presence in the quiet of my home, reading entries from her diary as though she could hear me, sometimes pausing to shed tears, sometimes smiling at her small victories and keen observations. And in that rhythm, I discovered a new closeness, a connection transcending time and distance, because love need not be contingent on physical proximity. It could endure across decades of separation. Conversations with the lawyer became collaborative storytelling sessions where we discussed the implications of her documents, pieced together her travels and choices, and interpreted her words in ways that honored her agency and individuality. And through those discussions, I realized that resolution required both patience and careful attention, a willingness to let go of assumptions while embracing truths that were sometimes difficult to hear. My adult children observed the transformation in me with quiet fascination, noticing how I moved through the house with a lighter step, how my eyes softened with a sense of peace that had long been absent, and occasionally they asked questions, careful, measured, and tender about their aunt and the life she had lived, and I answered as fully as I could, knowing that in sharing these truths, I was weaving her presence into our family narrative in a way that would persist for generations, ensuring that her story was no longer a gap in our history, but a living part of it.
I began to speak with other relatives who had known her indirectly, sharing the documents and letters in order to gather context, and each conversation revealed nuances I had missed, small details of friendships, kindnesses, or challenges she had faced, painting a picture of a sister who had not vanished, but had existed deliberately and meaningfully beyond our sight. And acknowledging that reality shifted the lens through which I had viewed loss for decades. At the same time, I confronted my own emotions with honesty, allowing grief, relief, pride, and longing to coexist without judgment. And I recognized that this balance was essential for true resolution, because to fully honor Leela was to honor the totality of our shared history, including the pain of absence and the beauty of endurance. Slowly, I reintegrated her memory into daily life, placing photographs where they could be seen, keeping her letters in a safe space yet accessible, and telling stories of her adventures to grandchildren who had never known her, allowing them to appreciate the full richness of a life once thought lost. There were moments of quiet reflection when I would sit alone with her diary, reading passages describing ordinary routines, fears, and triumphs, and I realized that the ordinary nature of her days was precisely what made them extraordinary, because it was the everyday acts of resilience, kindness, and independence that had defined her life while remaining invisible to us. I understood, finally, that resolution did not erase the past, nor did it fill the years of absence, but it allowed the family to embrace both what was lost and what endured, weaving Leela's unseen life into the fabric of our collective memory. And in that weaving, I felt a profound peace settle over me, quiet, steady, and enduring, like sunlight spreading through a long-shuttered room, illuminating the corners of grief with understanding, love, and a deep, abiding respect for the sister who had walked her own path and whose story, long hidden, had now returned to us. Each day forward carried a subtle lightness, a sense that the journey through uncertainty and longing had reached a gentle plateau, and I could now move through the world with the knowledge that Leela's life, though separate from ours, had been full, real, and meaningful. And in acknowledging that truth, I experienced the rare, quiet satisfaction that comes when decades of searching, wondering, and hoping finally intersect with clarity, compassion, and love.
In the quiet aftermath of discovery and reconciliation, I found myself reflecting more than ever on the nature of life, loss, and the endurance of love, because Leela's story, once a void that shadowed our family, had become a living testament to resilience, patience, and the unseen strength that people carry within them, often without recognition or support. And in those reflections, I discovered that the lessons of her absence and return were not simply about finding answers, but about understanding the depth of connection that survives even decades of separation. I would sit by the window in the early morning, the soft light falling across the kitchen table where her letters and diary entries lay neatly stacked, and I could feel her presence in a gentle, almost imperceptible way, like a whisper of wind reminding me that family transcends time and circumstance, and that love can endure quietly even when unspoken. I began writing again, composing letters addressed to her, sometimes sent through the lawyer, sometimes kept private, as a means of keeping the connection alive, acknowledging her life while processing my own emotions. And in these written words, I found both catharsis and intimacy, a way to reconcile the sister I had known as a child with the woman she had become in solitude and strength. Sharing fragments of her story with my children and grandchildren became a ritual of remembrance and teaching, a way to pass forward the understanding that life is complex, that choices are often invisible to others, and that resilience and courage are not always heralded, but they leave indelible marks on the world, even when quietly lived. Each story we told about her, each lesson we extracted from her life and choices, became part of the fabric of our family history. And in telling these stories, I felt that the weight of years spent waiting and wondering was gradually transformed into a legacy of understanding, empathy, and hope.
because although we had missed decades together, we were no longer defined solely by absence. I noticed that the ordinary moments, the scent of brewed coffee, the laughter of grandchildren, the quiet hum of life around the house, took on new significance because I was now able to experience them with the awareness that even amid loss and separation, there is a persistent continuity of life and love, and that presence can be found in memories and stories, and in the acknowledgement of those who have shaped our lives quietly, unseen, and profoundly. Even as I reflected on the decades of silence and the complex journey of discovering her hidden life, I realized that closure is not a single moment, nor a simple answer, but a series of understandings and reconciliations that gently settle over the heart, allowing grief, love, and acceptance to coexist. And in that coexistence, I found a sense of peace that had eluded me for most of my life. With each passing day, I felt a subtle lightness, a quiet hope that, despite the years of uncertainty, the bonds of family, memory, and love endure, and that even when paths diverge, the connections remain, waiting for moments of clarity, recognition, and understanding to restore the wholeness we often believe is lost forever. As I moved forward carrying the knowledge of Leela's life fully in my heart, I began to notice how the small moments of each day had regained their depth and meaning because the shadow of uncertainty that had hung over our family for 60 years had finally lifted, and in its place came a calm, reflective presence, one that allowed grief and love to coexist without conflict, one that allowed me to honor her journey without erasing my own. I would walk through the house, seeing her photographs, her letters, and the traces of her hidden life, not as reminders of loss, but as affirmations of resilience, independence, and the quiet courage that had guided her for decades. And I felt gratitude for the fact that finally her story was known, preserved, and woven into the fabric of our family's memory. I shared her story with my children and grandchildren, not just as history, but as a lesson in patience, understanding, and compassion, teaching them that absence does not diminish love, that choices are often shaped by circumstances unseen, and that human lives are intricate tapestries of joy, sorrow, courage, and quiet endurance, all deserving of recognition and respect. Sometimes, when the house was still and the afternoon light streamed across the living room, I would sit with her diary or letters in hand, letting her words speak across time, imagining her reading mine in return. And in those moments, I felt a gentle bridge of connection, a reconciliation of what was lost with what endured, proving that love can traverse even the longest separations. I learned to carry both memory and truth with equal care, allowing each to inform the other, and in doing so, I felt a serenity I had never known before, a soft, lasting acknowledgement that life, even when marked by absence, ultimately holds the possibility of restoration, understanding, and peace. And so, in the twilight of my years, I could smile quietly to myself, knowing that the sister I had loved as a child, the woman I had longed to find, and the family who had endured decades of uncertainty were now bound together in a new, gentle clarity, a testament to the enduring power of love, memory, and the courage to seek truth no matter how long it takes, leaving me with a quiet hope that, even in the midst of life's deepest mysteries, there is always a path toward understanding, reconciliation, and enduring connection.